You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 525 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking the police militarization here in the U.S. The big news is Trump's decision to withdraw 12,000 troops from Germany, and updates on Afghanistan, including a ceasefire that's going to take place over this weekend. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. Find it online at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor. I write the daily news roundup as well as producing this podcast, and both can be found on the homepage. And you could donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so the first thing I got today is this very interesting tweet by Donald Trump we got Thursday morning saying that there's two parts to the tweet, and the second one is more controversial, but just to touch on the first one, what he says is that there's a difference between the mail-in voting that's being proposed where they send a ballot to everyone versus the absentee where you have to apply and then get your ballot and then you send it back in. So, I do agree that there's a distinction, and certainly with the, mail the ballots out to everyone, have them mail them back in, there are several problems with that system. It seems likely to lead to more voter fraud. And also, people who have fluid addresses, there's 500,000 homeless people in this country. There are people who, live in week-to-week housing, live out in motels and stuff like that. Gonna be hard for them to, get that ballot. And, these are people in communities that Democrats are typically very concerned about. And so I'm kind of curious that they're so pro doing the mail out to everybody balloting, just because it seems like suburban people, a family, 2 parents, 2-3 adult children living in a home somewhere right now because everybody's locked up together. Well, they're definitely, going to be able to get all their ballots fairly easily, where it's going to be, the low income people moving around that may struggle a little bit more to make that happen. So I don't know. I just find that as kind of an interesting insight. And, if we really do want to mail ballots out to everybody, that seems like a real debate that the country should be having now because, we're 100 days out from the election. Also, big questions on that related to, we have this virus that, while it doesn't seem to necessarily be very deadly for people under the age of 50 or 60, whenever you look at people in the upper age brackets, it does become something that is killing not a significant number, but, people in their 70s die like 1 or 2% of the time. And so looking at the age of our candidates, certainly just looking at Donald Trump's figure, he's not the healthiest man. And if you believe the reporting on his diet, then, certainly I'm sure he has some cardiovascular issues and, that is comorbidity along with, getting COVID or something like that. And then Joe Biden, his health concerns are well documented. I was watching a video of him today looking like he need to be guided by somebody to get like from a storefront to a car. And so it seems like if there are 2 people in the country that would be a little bit more susceptible to COVID, it is the 2 candidates. And so let's say people vote for Biden in September, and then he gets sick, he dies, he drops out because of, mental reasons or whatever. What then happens to all those ballots? Do you send back? But then if you send them back, that means who sent them in, which seems to be problematic, especially if, Trump was anywhere near the fascist that people claim he was. Well, certainly you wouldn't want to have him with documented proof that you voted for the other guy in the election against him. So there's a lot of complications with that, but the obviously bigger part of this tweet is the second part, where Trump adds, delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote, ? So obviously this is Donald Trump just floating the idea of postponing the election. So I guess the first point to make is this probably isn't going to happen. Congress has control here. The Dems won't let it happen. So it's just, Donald Trump saying it. Why? I'm sure, the 4D chess Trump people have 4 or 5 reasons. My guess is he's desperate in the polls. Things haven't been going particularly well. I don't necessarily think all of his decisions are wrong, but he isn't able to defend them even against weak attacks from the left. And so it ends up being a gigantic smoldering mess every single time. He's surrounded himself mostly with people who don't share his views and his best views on foreign policy and stuff like that. And so, he hasn't been able to follow through on any promises either. So, things in a lot of ways are not going well for the Trump administration. And just seeing how, Trump has acted, during his, time as a candidate, it seems he often gets belligerent the worse he does in the polls. And so this seems to be him just kind of taking a wild swing at things. It is worth saying too, though, that this isn't a quality that you want from somebody running for president, just because one of the things we have going for us in the United States is that we can transition from leader to leader without bloodshed, something that a lot of countries don't enjoy. And, as much as I want the U.S. government to significantly change and ultimately, be completely unrecognizable from what exists today, I don't think the way to do it is by, throwing into massive chaos around a transition of power where, maybe you have different branches of the military, different military people picking different sides, different regions picking different sides, and you end up with the real bad kind of chaos that could be happening. All right, so next up, I have quite a few stories about police abuse and police militarization, starting up with Trump's plan to deploy federal police, dozens of them, to 3 cities, Detroit, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. I will say I haven't been covering the protests everywhere. There's so many still going on in all these different cities. And, a place like Milwaukee, I guess, isn't on the top of the list of cities you would think about when it comes to ongoing protests and rioting. But yet, that's still going on. And so apparently we're going to have federal police deployed there. I'm unclear if they're going to be using the, same tactics that we've seen in Portland that have drawn so much outrage, and rightfully so, picking on people and throwing them in the vans like this. Of course, the problem is just like in Portland, this is likely to provoke the same escalation from, the protester or rioter side, however you want to call it. And we're going to see the protesters start to deploy some of the tactics they're using in Portland, which, are disturbing, especially some of these kind of homemade firework bombs they're using. You're really afraid that throwing these at cops, could potentially hurt burn a police officer severely. I suppose that they up their game into, a little bit more bomb style than potentially talking about fatalities. But my concern is almost more some, kid running up with something that's essentially 5 sparklers taped together and getting shot in the face by some cop. And, this provoking a larger conflict and confrontation. As much as we need to be calling for the police to stop doing what they're doing, the protesters certainly need to start ramping down their tactics as well. Some of this stuff is just getting out of hand. So, people are upset, I think, to some degree about the police tactics being used. Some of these are very, the throwing people in unmarked vans, very disturbing. By the way, we have some video from the NYPD doing this now, so it's not like this is just limited to the federal police. Police departments are using it. And so it's just with having the tanks on the street and stuff like that, these, were at one time weapons of war meant for Baghdad, but are now police tools used on the streets of Portland and St. Louis and wherever else. The small town, I guess not super small, but smaller town that I lived in New Hampshire, Dover, had a Bearcat that they stored in the building that I worked under. I never actually saw them use it for anything, but still, for the people that you have in that town, that was always completely unnecessary. So you have that stuff going on. It looks like 2 representatives, AOC and Ted Lieu, have introduced a amendment to some appropriations bill that would apparently defund this specific operation that Trump is doing, where he's deploying these units to these cities. I think the problem with this is it's not any sweeping, reform. It's just saying that, you specifically don't have money to do Portland. Although it seems like Trump renames the operation, starts something new. Biden comes along, and whoever is directing that administration decides, they want to crack down on protests somewhere, I think they could very easily, exploit the President Trump to then, send federal troops, let's say, to enforce gun laws at a state level or something like that. And, I see this as being very problematic of the deployment of federal forces, and that, this proposal by AOC obviously doesn't go far enough. In North Carolina, the Charlotte police apparently suspected a man who had a warrant out for his arrest of being in a family's home. It's unclear why they suspected that, but they contacted the family, who weren't in the home at the time. And the family said, that person's not there, but we'll give you the key. Police then have the key. They contact the SWAT team. They say, hey, we have a warrant out for this guy. He's dangerous. We think he's in this house. SWAT shows up. I'm assuming they barked commands at the house for a while before they just deployed tear gas, flashbangs, smoke grenades into the house, busted windows and doors and stuff like that. And then end up opening the door with the key they got from the family, going in and discovering that that person wasn't in that home. And so, first of all, you just wonder how they, could be so reckless as to not do some surveillance before they just throw tear gas and flashbangs into a house. I know the family said it was empty, but imagine had, that guy not been there, but, a family pet, maybe a kid was in there or something like that. These weapons could be dangerous. So, just using them so indiscriminately is shocking. But, then to have done all this and not even know the guy was home or not is quite amazing. Obviously, he wasn't presenting a threat. There wasn't a threat coming from inside this home because, this home was empty. But it just shows the length of force that these SWAT teams will use with absolutely no resistance to them at all. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is, again, a critique of the DNC and just how terrible the Democratic Party is. So they had a proposal to change the party platform. I know that this doesn't matter really what the party platform says. I don't think if they adopt this, then Joe Biden's going to suddenly change his opinion on marijuana and legalize it. However, it does show where the elected officials of the Democratic Party are in their thinking, and they voted 100-50 not to have a proposal that approves the legalization of marijuana. And just, the problem with policing so many times is that it's these minor drug laws or something, traffic laws, that are the pretext that start these altercations that ultimately lead to, George Floyd being killed, Philando Castile being killed. Breonna Taylor's a little bit different, but this is part of the drug war again. And, it shows that the Democrats are, willing to take a standing, even though it's publicly popular now, but to change something that has, been long set in stone is, an important part to the, policing and the prison, public and private sector economy where, we have all these quote unquote private prisons and police forces that so much of their budget depends on the drug, where the legalization of marijuana will really eat into that. So they don't want it. All right, getting into a couple COVID stories real quick. We had the Miami police writing tickets to over 150 people so far for not following the mandatory mask mandate. Several people are reporting that the mask rules aren't people who are going to Trader Joe's without masks on, but rather the people who spent an hour and a half with the mask on, waiting in line at Trader Joe's and then going in and shopping and then walking back out to their car. Nobody's around. They're about to get in their car, take their mask off. You get a couple good breaths of fresh air into your lungs after, breathing your own breath in the mask for the past hour and a half. And this is when police are just coming up and writing tickets. A guy reported that he was in a barber shop, wanted to take a drink, moved his mask down to take a drink. And when that happened, he was issued a ticket. Miami police report they're having 500 random encounters, I guess, like chats every day to see if people are wearing masks. This is extremely disturbing policing. And my guess is in the long run, if it continues, it's going to, start to produce the kind of conflicts that produce situations like George Floyd. The other COVID story I have is about Don Trump Jr. and Madonna getting suspensions or, having their stuff censored from Twitter for posting alternative views on coronavirus. I find it disturbing because I think, we're growing closer and closer to this idea that you have to be saying what is in the consensus or what you are saying is dangerous. And that's simply not the case. You have this lady who apparently has been successfully treating people with coronavirus. It's this woman doctor who, was quickly became, YouTube famous because she was speaking that, hey, I have all these patients, I'm treating them this way and it's helpful. And then people dig up that, she once said something about demon semen or believes that demon semen makes people sick, rather than just saying that, oh, this is why what she says isn't supported by the science. No, it's not degrade and cancel these people. As the result, we had to censor them. We had to shut them up. And this is more representative of a group of people who actually don't think they're in the right. They don't think that the truth is on their side. And so they have to make sure that they control the narrative so tightly that other points of view, can't come to light, because then they'll, clearly show you as a fraud. This is what happened with Russiagate in the lead up to the Iraq war as well. I guess I will say that, just to point out that those were complete fictions, the Russiagate and Iraq war, where, people are dying from coronavirus. Obviously, anybody who's listened to the show, I've said, take it seriously, do your research, and, take the steps that you feel are important. And I know that there's a lot of disagreement on that. I'm certainly not a virologist, so I can't prescribe to you, wear a mask, don't, make your own decision, but inform yourself. Looking at the coronavirus stimulus bill that we got out of the Senate, the first thing it includes is $1.75 billion to rebuild the FBI building. I guess the location of the building, the new building, is near the Trump Hotel, and so everybody's kind of focusing on that angle. At the same time, why do we want to spend $1.75 billion on a new FBI building? I say we spend $0 on a new FBI building, and to the extent that the government needs to give $1.75 billion to anyone, make it people who have been, put out of work by the government. It seems to be really the only thing that the government should be spending the money on this time. If not, just, leave it for people to get tax breaks or put towards the deficit, something like that. Not only is there that money for the FBI building, but then there's $30 billion in Pentagon funding in this $1 trillion, what they call stimulus, but it's really just a bailout bill. They're talking about maybe another $1,200 check for everyone, some continued increase in unemployment benefits, but, largely, I guess this will turn into another bailout, for the people who are connected to the politicians. I believe included in the $30 billion for the Pentagon is even more money for F-35s, the useless fighter jet that I've covered. The Pentagon doesn't need more, but Congress keeps giving them more. I'm sure Lockheed Martin's heavily lobbying and saying like, hey, more planes equals more jobs during the coronavirus economic downturn. But creating more planes doesn't it's artificial. It's not real wealth. It doesn't help us, Yes, maybe they're passenger planes, but really not, even at a time like this, do we need those? So, the big story I want to talk about is Trump deciding to remove 12,000 troops from Germany. We had the official announcement now. Yay, this is good news that he's willing to do this. Now, there are some problems with it, including 5,000 of those troops are going to remain in Europe. Some going to Poland, some going to Italy, but the majority going to Belgium to join, I guess, NATO headquarters. Ultimately, this isn't any kind of real shift in policy. Even if Trump gets a second turn, this doesn't seem like, he's saying, oh, my goal is to reduce, NATO dependence on the U.S. and I'm slowly going to withdraw U.S. troops from Europe. It's specifically to punish Germany. I'm guessing that Germany is getting some of the punishment because they aren't meeting, the 2% minimum of GDP spending on defense. And, it's very obviously that the U.S. is subsidizing German defense, but Trump has had some pretty public disputes and spats with Angela Merkel. And so it wouldn't be surprising to me if that's also contributing to why, Germany ends up being the country that Trump removes troops from. Now, it does sound like about 6,400 U.S. troops will be coming home at least for some time. And I believe that the 2,500 or 25,000 cap for Germany is still going to exist. And then the official troop level right now will be 24,000. And so still way too many troops in Germany. But that's a little bit of good news. The bad news, of course, is this has turned into more Russia hysteria, that this was obviously orders that Donald Trump received from Vladimir Putin. Trump, who has been the most anti-Russian U.S. president, I guess, ever, because, before, or at least, you had the USSR for all those years. So, there's some anti-Soviet presidents that I'm sure top him out. But, Trump has been destroying the international arms agreements that are so critical to the U.S.-Russia relationship. He hasn't worked anything out in Syria. He hasn't worked anything out in Libya. He's upped the support for Ukraine. He's now threatening to sanction the Nord Stream pipeline. He's sanctioned Russia for very, very dubious reasons and claims. He's incredibly against his Russian policy. And yet, the narrative that you'll get if you just look at the chat marks on Twitter is that Donald Trump's a Putin puppet. Donald Trump's a Putin puppet. It's simply not true. And it's absurd at this point that they're still able to claim that, when a much better criticism of Donald Trump is that he's been far too aggressive against Russia, and rather than looking at diplomacy, has gone the George W. Bush, John Bolton route and just ripped up agreements. Now, the U.S. and Russia are apparently back in Vienna talking about nuclear arms and arms control agreements. Unfortunately, it seems like the U.S. is really sticking with this whole China has to be involved line, and China saying that, look, your nuclear arsenal is multiple times bigger than ours. We're not getting involved unless your arsenal's around the same size as ours, and then we could talk. And since, the U.S. and Russia don't seem to be anywhere near even talks to just stabilize the current level of nuclear weapons, it's going to be unlikely that they, come to some kind of agreement where they each drop to 300 nukes, and then, suddenly, China and the UK are willing to come into agreements on restricting their nuclear weapons even more. The big problem here is that if the U.S. and Russia can't come to some kind of agreement by February of 2021, then the last major remaining nuclear arms control agreement, in effect, the New START treaty, would fall apart. And then, I guess there's still agreements like the NPT, but the U.S. and the Soviet Union, or the Russians, could really get back to building up their nuclear arsenals if that's what they want to do. And the U.S. already has allocated $2 trillion over the next 20 or 30 years now to spend on upgrading their nuclear arsenal. The effects of withdrawing from these agreements are severe, because when, let's say, the U.S. withdraws from New START, Russia is going to say, well, they're withdrawing to build up their nuclear arsenal because we've announced we're spending $2 trillion on our nuclear arsenal. And so now we have to spend money to upgrade ours, so the U.S. can't get first strike advantage, take out Russia, and then be the, remaining superpower in the world. They want to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's going to cause Russia and China to build up things like hypersonic missiles. And so the world in total will spend more collective energy and money in the U.S. and Russia and China on these weapons that are fairly, poorly performing. There's a good article by Andrew Coburn on how they really don't work as they're supposed to, and yet we're going to pour so much time and money and everything into these weapons. It's going to be a total waste. All right, so a couple more stories before we wrap up here. The U.S. announces sanctions on 2 former Venezuelan officials. And a little bit of good news, the Taliban and the Afghan government have agreed to hold a ceasefire for a religious holiday coming up over the weekend. I think it was in 2018, 2 years ago, that they held the first ceasefire, I believe, in the entire Afghan war. So that was good for this same holiday. And we're seeing that again. The last time this produced pictures of the Taliban being in cities they haven't been in 20 years, and fighters on both sides hanging around and shaking hands. Hopefully we get more of that. And at this point, where there is already an agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban, and Donald Trump does seem somewhat interested in getting out of the country before the election, maybe this could spiral very quickly into a very positive bout of diplomacy, where the U.S. could withdraw troops from Afghanistan. We could maybe produce some kind of, even if it's a short-term thing, but a relatively more peaceful situation where, in the first 6 months of 2020, we had 1,200 civilians be killed by this conflict. In Yemen, the Southern Transitional Council, these are the people who want to create a South Yemen state, have said that they are now giving up those ambitions and moving back towards just being a part the governing coalition with the Saudi forces. This seems to go back and forth based on what kind of deal they're getting from the Saudis. It seems like the Saudis were maybe as the Hadi government, who's the Yemeni figurehead of the Saudi-backed government, that's kind of pulling the plug on the agreements. But it goes back and forth where, the STC breaks off from the Saudi government, then they come back in, then they break off, then they come back in. We'll see if this is a more permanent solution or if it happens again. This last conflict seemed more severe and to last longer, and the STC took a little bit more territory. And so I'm wondering if maybe the Saudis threatened to ramp up their warfare against them, or if they maybe cut a better deal, or the Houthis were taking advantage too much of the ongoing conflict, because they're on kind of the third side of this war. Well, really, I guess the second, where is the main war is fought between the Saudi, the U.S., the Hadi government against the Houthis. All right, then the last thing, we have reports of U.S. or Somali civilians being killed by U.S. drone strikes. 3 children were reported to be killed in a drone strike last week, and the U.S. admitted to killing somebody in a drone strike in February. Far too often what happens is the U.S. doesn't say anything about the airstrikes unless somebody asks. When they do, they claim they kill Al-Shabaab or ISIS. When people say it's civilians, they say no. Maybe 6 months, maybe a year later, the U.S. goes, oh yeah, maybe we did kill one civilian along with some Al-Shabaab fighters. And we never really understand the truth that, these are probably just innocent people that were blown up by a U.S. bomb for no reason. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. Hope everybody's enjoying it. Make sure you share it, libertarianinstitute.org. My Twitter handle has changed. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _. Make sure you follow me. Thanks, everyone.